Wow, what an awesome tree. I'm gonna spend a moment figuring out my approach, walking around a little bit, and nature journal this charismatic old tree. Do you recognize this place where I am right now? It was only a couple of months ago that I was nature journaling here on a rainy day. My outfit was a little bit different and it was really wet and cold. And I asked all of you if you wanted me to do another video nature journaling this tree up here, because I found this tree on that rainy day and it was so striking and charismatic that I wanted to come back and nature journal it, and you all voted that I should do a video about it. So here I am. Here's the tree. It's a beautiful day. It's quite still. I'm gonna figure out what would be the best nature journaling approach. Probably gonna lean heavily on drawing and just like a purely artistic aesthetic approach, because it's such a beautiful life form here. The first thing I'm gonna do to nature journal this tree is I'm gonna go pick a little twig off the tree and use that twig to draw the tree, dipping the twig in ink. So you might have noticed I'm wearing all black today. Well, usually you should wear earth tones when you're out nature journaling, right? So you don't scare animals away and you blend in more. Well, in this case, I'm gonna be using this messy ink technique. So I decided that I should wear a black shirt. So when picking a twig, you don't want something that's too brittle, but you can experiment with different twigs and see the effects that you get. So I'm gonna look for, I think for right now, I want one that's a little more alive. And it looks like this tree, despite how many leafless branches it has, it is leafing out. So especially on this side. So this looks a little bit thick to me. This looks great right here. That one might be dry. That's a dry one, but it feels pretty substantial, so I think I'm gonna use that. Maybe use this one here, and I will sharpen these with a knife. If you're doing this with kids and other people who potentially don't want using a very sharp knife, or you have to travel on a plane or something like that, you can use potato peelers. That's what Lori Wiggum uses in all of her classes where she teaches this. Okay, so I got a few sticks to choose from, and I'm gonna take them back to my spot. And let me show you something really cool about my spot. You probably already know about this chair. I love this chair. It's the Joey Travel Chair, or Joey Chair by Travel Chair, something like that. I'll put the link in the description below. It's such a good chair for nature journaling. But even cooler is I found a spot where I could wedge my sun hat in the tree. Of course, using one of my favorite tools in nature journaling, this bulldog clip right here. I attached my hat to the tree so that my nature journal pages will be shaded, and that'll make it easier for you to see my nature journal pages. It will mean I don't have to wear sunglasses and combine those with binoculars, which is not very good. Whoa, I almost committed that dangerous error. So I'm gonna sharpen these sticks right now and do an ink drawing of that tree. This isn't totally water soluble ink, so what I might do is paint my watercolor wash and then do the ink on top, which is something I usually don't do. So let's see how it goes. So it looks like these have a pithy center on them. So I'm just gonna try to get sort of like a spatula shaped tip on these if I can. I like this one. Here's the green one. I think this one's gonna be better actually. The green ones are less brittle and they're easier to carve into a desirable shape without breaking. Even though this is kind of cute on the end of my drawing tool, you would have to pay extra for that at the art store. All this frill on here, and the fact that it's from the tree I'm drawing is pretty magical, but for just practicality, I'm going to cut these off. Alright, let me try not to get any ink on myself. Alright, I'm going to open up this ink carefully. Alright, so I'm going to do a little analysis of what I just drew, and I think sometimes to practice your metacognition, it's good to do a critique of your own nature journal pages, your own art, and your own observations. So one of the things I want to just note is the fact that I sort of had a plan when I started, and I'm looking at this tree over here, this charismatic old tree, and nature journaling this tree today, that one right there. And my original plan was to break some twigs off of that tree and use those for an ink drawing, and that I was going to do watercolor underneath and sort of just like loose, focused on mostly on the artistic rendering of the tree. It's sort of fun and loose and messy, and that was my general plan, so sort of like an intention. And I knew I wanted to do a full page spread, and sitting a ways back from the tree so I can see the whole thing. My plan was also to I've been using this black Sumi ink, which is like the cheap black ink that you can get at any art store. This was on sale for $3.29, so it's like, if you think about it, that's a lot of ink in there. And this is the carved stick that I've been using. But my original plan was to put down watercolor first, because this ink is not waterproof. It's completely water soluble, or I think it is pretty water soluble. and if I paint over it with watercolor, it's probably going to get all messy. So I forgot about that when I got all excited after carving my sticks and just went straight into it. So that's one thing that I can think about and reflect on about in my process. The other thing I want to point out is that partly because it's a tree, or mainly because it's a tree, this drawing, even though it's pretty loose and I didn't create like an underdrawing to get the proportions or anything precise, and it's a complex subject matter, so there's a lot that I have distorted proportion wise or details that I've forgotten. However, because it's a tree and people don't have as much of their visual cortex dedicated to looking at trees as they do to looking at faces, that means that if I had done the same approach with a person's face, I probably would not have a result that looked somewhat, in my opinion, okay, as far as like art and representation goes. But if that had been a face or even an animal other than a human, and even more the case if it were a human, people will look at it and see like, oh, that's not quite right, or that's a little bit different, or that's a little bit odd. But that's, I think, one of the fun things about drawing charismatic old trees is you can be kind of loose with it. So that's sort of my review here. I feel like I did learn a lot and get a drop into the place and create this sort of establishing shot, which allows me to go more into some of the other nature journaling stuff. I think I am going to try another one where I do the watercolor underneath. This still needs some time to dry. As you can see, there's like these huge bits of wet ink still. One thing that's good to know is that a lot of times when you do this kind of dip pen drawing with ink in your nature journal, it's going to leave some serious layers of ink that can actually rub off. So if you have a paper towel, the best thing you can do, or like a sometimes I use parchment paper, and you take a piece of that and you put it in between these two pages right here, and you can use tape. This would be a good reason to have a little bit of Scotch tape in your nature journal kit, and you can just tape that page right there. I don't have Scotch tape, so I'm going to use my bulldog clip to hopefully keep that page slightly protected. That way, if I'm doing stuff on the other side and sort of pushing down, it's not going to transfer those lines, because especially when you're doing like a stark ink drawing, those little imperfections can actually take away a lot from the visual power of that piece. And now I'm going to actually do the thing that I should have done first if I were nature journaling this charismatic old tree in a logical order, in a logical way. And that is small value studies. So instead of tackling the whole tree, instead of tackling a full page drawing, I'm going to fit it into a small area using my viewfinder. I'm going to use my small viewfinder right here, and that way I'm going to limit the amount of information that I'm seeing and focus on understanding the major value relationships. Right, so I have this value study right here using graphite, and I tried to do a value strip at the bottom showing the 3 values I'm going to use, going from my lightest light to my darkest dark, and just keeping it at 3 values. You can see right now there's basically 2 values, 2.5 values. I rubbed it in the graphite. Now I'm going to use my eraser to go back and get the white spots. So this is not only just a good way to learn how to draw a better charismatic old tree, but it also helps you figure out what's possible. So just in doing this quick drawing, I learned a bunch of things that would have probably been good to know before I took on that bigger ink drawing. And so some of those things include that I have a very complex value relationship. It's not something easy to simplify like what I usually look for in a landscape etho. So I'm going to try simplifying it a little bit more, the value relationships and that composition, in my next drawing. The other thing that I learned is that there's a lot of pale lines my lightest value lines making long skinny crosses over dark values, and that's a problem when you're working with ink or watercolor or something that is additive, and it just gets darker and darker as you add more of your ink or watercolor. You can't go back the other way and get lighter. So because I have these branches, I can either try to reserve the white, which is always a challenge, or I could use an opaque tool such as the jumbo correction pin, whiteout pin, or this is like the Signo, Uniball Signo fine or broad, I can't remember. Anyways, those are your other options. And just by doing this, I learned that that will be an issue. So doing these value studies in about 10 minutes or maybe even 7 minutes will give you a lot of information about the drawing or the painting that you're about to do. So I don't usually use this technique, and I think that's why I went into autopilot with my first drawing and went straight to the drawing with the ink dip pins, dipsticks I should say, dipsticks. Anyways, this is the watercolor background I just did, and I don't usually do it this way, but I'm gonna let this dry and then I'm gonna draw with ink on top of that. Meanwhile, I'm going to put some metadata, which I skipped completely. It's dangerous when you're putting your drawing supplies on the ground. I usually do not do that. So I'm experimenting here with a bigger metadata stamp. I usually recommend having a consistent stamp or a consistent way you do metadata, a consistent way you do landscapitos, and if you have that consistency, your pages have this nice flow to them and you also get better. But sometimes it is good to mess around and experiment. So I don't know why, but I just went more on the loose end and not following my consistent metadata pattern on this, and I made sort of a bigger one here, and you can see at the bottom I usually show weather symbols in my metadata, giving an idea of, like, you know, how sunny it is, there's no clouds, and maybe I'll even do a quick drawing of the terrain, the general terrain of the area, so like some little cartoony mountains if it's mountainous. Here I went a little bit further than that and actually created sort of a diagram of my location within this particular regional park, and this will help me remember exactly where this tree is, and it's also just something I want to experiment with a little bit more. So my watercolor in the meantime on this side has dried, so I'm going to go ahead and do my ink work on top of it. We'll see how that goes. So I just noticed myself getting kind of uncomfortable physically, a little bit frustrated about my drawing, and a little bit self-critical, and a little bit rushed and impatient all at the same time. And so instead of just pushing forward and being impatient and just trying to finish this really quickly, I'm going to take a little break and stretch and come back to it, because I think paying attention to yourself and sort of your own comfort and being your own coach and being your own parent is and your own advocate when you're nature journaling is super important, because that way you set yourself up for success. So I'm just going to take a little break and pay attention to that sort of beginning of a doubt in my mind and that frustration. Let this ink dry a little bit and come back to it in a second. All right, so this has been a pretty experimental page for me, and I did another video drawing how to nature journal charismatic old trees, where I talk about some basic tips. This has been a little bit more on the artistic side, the experimental side, which is a good thing to do every once in a while, is to try some different styles. If you're more on the natural history side, scientific side in your nature journaling, or you're more on the verbal side, try experimenting with the opposite or the other end of the spectrum, and go back and forth, and you learn that way. So also with your materials and your techniques, it's good to experiment with those every once in a while also, and maybe create some expectations around that for yourself that reflect what you're actually trying to get. So if you haven't thought about your expectations in your nature journaling or your goals, definitely check out my mindset video, where I talk about how getting clear about what you're actually trying to do with your nature journaling is absolutely necessary if you're going to judge your work. So if you're gonna be kind of questioning, oh, there's a hummingbird coming right towards me. I don't know if you heard that, but that hummingbird got really close. So for example, with this, if my main goal is to collect important scientific information in my nature journaling, maybe this technique doesn't make the most sense. If my goal is to have fun and to experiment and to learn, trying new things and pushing my boundaries around artistic materials is probably a good idea. So this is a little bit about that. I'll be doing some future videos, how to nature journal old trees, where I will do charcoal and use the charcoal as a basic drawing tool. I've got my page here, and just to do a little review of it, or sort of self-critique, one of the main things I'm noticing in this is this huge gap in my value gradient. So here you can see an example of a value strip with 3 values, and a drawing that basically reflects those, uses only those 3 levels of light and dark. And what I'm noticing here, especially when I squint my eyes, is there's basically 2.5 or 2.25. So there's the full white of the page, and which is only about like half a degree of difference. It's not very different from these watercolor tones here, this being sort of the darkest, and then this ink is the full dark. And what there is not, what is lacking is sort of some of those in-between values, and so that makes the drawing look maybe a little incomplete, and coming back with some maybe like even opaque gouache and putting in those values could be an interesting approach. So sometimes it's good to stop and look at things like that, and look at your artwork and your nature journal pages and sort of reflect on them, critique on them in the most objective way you can. That is a great metacognitive skill that you can get out of your nature journaling, and when it's on paper, it's easier to dissociate from it and not take it as personally. So being able to reflect objectively and critique basically your own work is super important. So it's been a somewhat an experimental session of nature journaling this charismatic old tree. I did a previous video where I talked about how to nature journal a charismatic old tree. So if you want sort of more of a step-by-step, check that one out. Otherwise, check out the playlist where I'm going to be talking about and nature journaling a bunch more charismatic old trees using different techniques. Today was a little bit of an experimental one, using more artistic techniques and using this really fun sort of tool combination that is really simple. It's really great for kids, really entertaining. I learned about this from Lori Wiggum primarily, and she has some great tips about how to do this and use it for urban sketching. And a really fun technique if you want to practice your mark making a little bit more. If you're more of a technical nature journaler, this is a great way to loosen up and get a little bit more artistic with your mark making. And practicing this way and then going back to your regular nature journaling is going to have an impact on your pages. Trust me. So if you can't wait all the way until next week for the next episode of the show, check out these videos here. Bye.